The whisper before dawn, it was late evening on the studio lot. The kind of golden hour that feels almost unreal, when the light turns soft and everything slows down. Sandra Bullock stood near her trailer, her heart unusually heavy, watching the sky melt into shades of amber and rose. She had spent decades under these lights, but this moment felt different. The film they were shooting had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, and yet tonight wasn't about acting. Tonight was about something real, something that had been quietly growing between her and Keanu Reeves for years. Something unspoken, but deeply alive. Keanu had just finished his final scene for the day. The crew clapped. The director nodded, and he gave that familiar, humble smile that never tried to own the moment. He walked toward Sandra slowly, his steps unhurried, his expression unreadable. Everyone around them started packing equipment, laughing, shouting goodbyes, but she could barely hear any of it. All she saw was him. Calm. Steady. Quietly magnetic. They had worked together before, decades ago, and their connection had been immediate. Not loud or dramatic, but subtle, full of mutual respect. She had admired his patience, his kindness, the way he treated every person, from the cameraman to the assistant, with the same quiet dignity. And somewhere between those years and this new project, admiration had turned into something deeper, something she could no longer name without trembling. That evening, they sat together on a small wooden bench near the set, sipping tea in silence. The sky had dimmed completely now, leaving only the hum of crickets and the faint sound of traffic from a distant road. Keanu leaned back, watching the night spread over the hills. "You look tired," he said softly. She smiled faintly, hiding the storm inside. "Maybe a little, but it's a good kind of tired." He nodded, still looking away, as if giving her space to breathe. Sandra had always admired that about him, the way he never filled silence just to avoid it. He respected quiet moments like they were sacred, and right now, that silence was heavy with everything she'd never dared to say. The shoot had been emotionally draining. Her character had to express love, grief, and forgiveness all in one scene. Emotions she could only perform so truthfully because they mirrored something she felt off-screen. Every time she looked into his eyes during a take, her heart had whispered things she could never speak aloud. And tonight, she felt she couldn't carry that weight anymore. "Keanu," she began, her voice almost breaking, "can I tell you something without you judging me?" He turned to her, gentle and curious. "You never have to worry about that." She looked down, playing with the edge of her cup. "Sometimes when we're filming, it doesn't feel like acting anymore. It feels like I'm saying things I actually mean." The air shifted slightly. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. He just listened, the way he always did, with full attention. "You know," he said after a long pause, "that's probably what makes you so good at it. You don't pretend. You feel." "But what if I'm feeling too much?" she asked, almost in a whisper. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time that evening she saw something flicker in his eyes. Something uncertain, something warm. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," he said quietly. Her heart pounded. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to tell him everything. How every moment with him felt too real, how every silence between them said more than 1,000 lines of dialogue. But she hesitated. The world knew them as friends, colleagues, professionals. She feared ruining that perfect, fragile balance. The next day, on set, things felt heavier. The script required an intimate scene, not romantic but emotionally raw. Their characters had to confront years of unspoken feelings, standing inches apart under the dim light of a half-broken street lamp. Sandra's hands trembled slightly before the take, not because of nerves, but because the line between fiction and truth was about to disappear. "Ready?" the director asked. Keanu nodded calmly. "Ready." As the cameras rolled, she looked into his eyes and forgot the script. Her lips moved, but her soul was the one speaking. Every emotion she had buried came rushing out, and when he responded, his tone wasn't acting either. It was as if two souls were speaking a language no one else could hear. When the director yelled cut, there was silence. The crew clapped softly, sensing they had witnessed something rare. but Sandra couldn't move. Keanu walked closer, whispering, "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. He gave her a long look, a look that said he understood far more than she wanted to admit. Then he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, steadying her heart. Later that night, Sandra sat alone in her trailer. She replayed every word, every glance. She wanted to stop herself from feeling this way, but love doesn't ask for permission. It just grows quietly in the corners of your heart, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then came the moment she couldn't have planned. It was almost midnight when someone knocked on her trailer door. When she opened it, Keanu was standing there holding 2 cups of coffee. He smiled shyly. "Couldn't sleep. Thought you might not be sleeping either." She laughed softly, her heart trembling again. "You're right," he handed her the cup. They sat on the small steps outside, surrounded by the soft night breeze and the smell of fresh paint from the nearby set. For a while, neither said anything. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know, sometimes I wish life had a director too. Someone who could yell cut when things get too complicated." He smiled. "Yeah, or someone who could say action when it's time to stop holding back." The words lingered in the air, heavier than the quiet around them. She looked at him, his calm expression, his kind eyes, the quiet sadness that always seemed to live behind them. And for the first time, she realized he wasn't as untouched as he seemed. Maybe he felt it too. Maybe he was just better at hiding it. Her hand brushed against his as she reached for her cup. He didn't pull away. Their fingers stayed there, still, connected, trembling slightly. She wanted to speak, to finally tell him everything, but all she managed was a whisper, barely audible. "Keanu." He turned his head slowly, eyes meeting hers, waiting. Her lips parted. The words she had held for years finally reached her tongue, but before she could finish, the assistant director shouted from across the lot, "We need you both early tomorrow for retakes." The spell broke. He stood, gave her that small, kind smile again, and whispered, "Get some rest, Sandra." And just like that, he was gone, leaving her heart suspended between courage and fear, truth and silence. She sat there long after he left, the night pressing close around her, her whisper unfinished. For the first time, she felt the weight of love not spoken, love restrained, love that waits. And she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The silence between words, the morning sun broke through the thin curtains of Sandra's trailer, painting soft stripes across the carpet. She hadn't slept much. Her mind had replayed that near confession again and again, the quiet moment when she almost told him how she truly felt. She could still hear her own whisper hanging unfinished in the air, interrupted by the call of duty, by the noise of reality. On set that day, everything looked the same, yet felt heavier. The crew laughed, cables coiled, cameras rolled, but underneath the usual rhythm was a strange current, an invisible tension between 2 people pretending nothing had changed. Sandra walked onto the set, her face calm, her eyes careful. Keanu was already there, speaking with the cinematographer, his expression serene as always. But when their eyes met just for a heartbeat, there was that familiar spark. Fragile, unspoken, undeniable. The director called them in for a scene. It wasn't romantic on paper, just a quiet exchange between 2 characters parting ways, standing under a streetlight. Yet as the cameras rolled, every line between reality and fiction blurred again. When Keanu looked at her, his voice low and steady, she felt her heart falter. "Take care of yourself," his character said. "I will," hers replied, but her voice cracked, betraying the truth beneath the words. When the scene ended, the director called it perfect, but she couldn't meet Keanu's eyes. It was too close to something real. She turned quickly, walking to her trailer before anyone could notice the tears starting to gather. A few minutes later, she heard a soft knock. She didn't need to guess who it was. "Come in," she said quietly. Keanu stepped in, closing the door gently behind him. He held 2 paper cups again, the same as last night, coffee, black for him, sweet for her. A silent gesture of care. "You were amazing in that scene," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "You make it easy to be real. There was a pause. He looked down as if weighing his next words. About last night? Her heart raced. The air seemed to thicken. You don't have to explain, she interrupted quickly. It was just, no, he said, his tone firm but kind. It wasn't just nothing. His honesty disarmed her. She looked at him, and for a long moment neither spoke. Their silence said everything, that they both felt something powerful but were too afraid to name it. Fame, friendship, years of keeping things professional, all those invisible walls stood between them. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, he took a step closer. Sandra, I've always respected you, more than you probably know. But there are things I've never said because... He trailed off, his voice faltering for once. Because it might ruin what we have, she finished softly. He nodded. Yeah, because sometimes being honest changes everything, and I don't want to lose the peace we've built. Her eyes softened. Peace can be lonely, you know. He smiled faintly, a sadness behind it. I know. They stood there in the quiet hum of the trailer, two souls caught between desire and restraint. Outside, someone shouted for lunch break, breaking the spell again. He set the coffee cup on her table, whispered, "See you later," and left before she could say a word. The rest of the day blurred by. Every time she caught sight of him, her chest tightened. She had spent her whole career mastering emotions for the camera, but nothing could prepare her for this. The ache of loving someone who might feel the same, but refuses to cross the line. That evening, she sat by herself in the makeup room long after everyone left. The mirrors reflected a woman who looked strong on the outside but was quietly breaking inside. She whispered to her reflection, "Why can't I just tell him?" The next few days went on like that. Long hours of filming, careful smiles, conversations that hovered at the edge of something deeper. And then came the charity gala. The studio had arranged it to celebrate the film's near completion. Everyone would be there, directors, producers, the media, and Keanu. She dressed in a simple black gown, elegant but understated. She didn't want to be seen, not by the cameras anyway. But when she walked into the ballroom, she couldn't help but search for him. He was standing near the balcony in a dark suit, his posture relaxed, his smile quiet. When their eyes met across the room, the noise around her faded completely. He walked toward her slowly, each step measured, calm as ever. "You look peaceful," he said when he reached her. "That's a first," she replied with a nervous laugh. They talked for a while, about ordinary things, travel, food, life between projects, both pretending not to feel the gravity of what lay underneath. Then the music shifted. The band began to play a slow, nostalgic tune. Couples started to dance. Keanu extended his hand, his voice soft. "May I?" She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the floor, moving slowly, gently. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for the cameras. It was two old souls sharing quiet space in a world that rarely allowed silence. "You know," she whispered, "sometimes I think fate keeps putting us together just to test how long we can pretend." He looked at her, his voice barely audible. "Maybe it's waiting for us to stop pretending?" Her breath caught. She felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. For a moment, everything felt suspended, the lights, the music, the world itself. But before she could speak, flashes exploded from nearby cameras. Photographers had spotted them. The moment shattered. Keanu immediately stepped back, instinctively protective. "Let's go outside," he whispered. They slipped through the crowd and out to the balcony, away from the noise. The night air was cool, the city lights stretching endlessly below. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Every time I try to tell you, something stops me." "Maybe the world isn't ready," he said gently. "Maybe we aren't," she replied. He leaned on the railing, looking out into the dark skyline. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we met somewhere else? Without all this noise, without cameras, without expectations?" "Every day," she admitted. They stood in silence, the kind that holds both peace and pain. Then, without meaning to, she reached out, touching his arm lightly. "Keanu, there's something I need to say." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "What is it?" Her heart raced. She took a breath, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "I think," she began, But just then the door burst open. One of the producers stepped out, calling his name. "Keanu, they need you for interviews." He glanced at her apologetically. "We'll talk later?" She nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, later." But as she watched him walk away once again, she knew that later had become their unspoken curse. Always close, never now. And yet, as the night deepened, she made herself a quiet promise. She wouldn't let fear keep her silent forever. She would find the moment, no matter how small, to finally whisper what her heart had been holding for years. Because some truths, no matter how fragile, deserve to be spoken. The moment the world stopped the morning after the gala, the studio buzzed with new energy. Cameras moved, lights blazed, and the air smelled of coffee and rain. Sandra walked onto the set with her usual calm smile. But inside, her thoughts were a storm. She had come so close the night before. Her heart had been right at the edge of honesty, trembling, ready to fall. And then, like always, something had pulled him away. But today felt different. Maybe it was the restless wind outside, or maybe it was the quiet exhaustion of pretending for too long. Something in her gut told her the universe was shifting, preparing her for a truth she could no longer postpone. Keanu arrived a little late, his motorcycle helmet still in his hand, his hair damp from the drizzle. He looked calm as always, but his eyes carried that same tired gentleness she'd noticed for weeks. When their eyes met across the set, the air changed. Subtle, invisible, but undeniable. "Morning," he said softly as he passed by. "Morning," she replied, pretending to check her script. The scene they were about to film was emotionally intense, a moment of loss, where their characters had to face years of unsaid things. The director wanted it raw, stripped of performance. It was perfect and terrifying at the same time. Before shooting, the crew gathered near the street set built for the scene. It had fake rain machines, slick cobblestones, and a dim lamppost. Everything looked hauntingly real. The director called, "Quiet on set?" And Sandra took her place in the rain. Cold drops slid down her face, mixing with her nerves. Keanu stood opposite her, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. "Action." She began her lines, her voice trembling, not from acting, but from the truth hiding underneath. "I thought we could fix it," she said, her character pleading. "But maybe we were never meant to be together." Keanu's reply was low, filled with something real. "Maybe we were meant to be, just not like this." Their eyes locked. Her breath caught. The rain fell harder. Every line felt like a confession disguised as dialogue. When the scene ended, no one moved. The director whispered, "Beautiful." But Sandra barely heard him. She was lost in Keanu's gaze, the unspoken words hanging between them heavier than any script. Then something happened. One of the lighting rigs, loosened by the artificial rain, began to tilt dangerously. A crew member shouted, but it was too late. The metal beam came crashing down toward Sandra. Keanu moved faster than anyone. He lunged forward, pulling her out of the way, his arm wrapping around her as the beam hit the ground with a deafening crash. The crew ran in panic, shouting her name, but she could only hear his heartbeat against her ear. For a moment, the world disappeared. No sound, no fear, just the warmth of his arms holding her tight. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. She nodded, still stunned. You could have been hurt." He smiled faintly, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "You're more important." Those 3 words pierced her deeper than anything. Not romantic, not planned, just honest. The kind of honesty that slips out when the heart forgets to hide. The crew checked on them, medics rushed in, but she barely noticed. Her hands trembled as she realized how close she had come to never getting another chance. Later, after the chaos settled and everyone went home, she found herself sitting in her car, unable to drive away. She watched the rain slide down the windshield and whispered to herself, "I can't stay silent anymore." The next day, filming resumed, though everyone was still shaken. Keanu arrived early, carrying coffee as usual, calm but distant. Maybe it was his way of coping, turning pain into stillness. During a break, she walked over to him, her heart steady this time. "Can we talk?" she asked. He nodded, setting down his cup. They walked to the edge of the lot, where the noise of the set faded into the sound of the wind. "You scared me yesterday," she began. "I'm fine," he said quickly, as if trying to brush it off. "That's not what I mean," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "You could have been seriously hurt. And all I could think about was—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "How much I would have lost if something happened to you." He looked at her quietly, his expression soft but guarded. "Sandra, no," she interrupted, her eyes wet now. "Let me finish. I've spent years convincing myself that what I feel for you is just friendship, respect, admiration, but it's not just that. It hasn't been for a long time." He stood still, his breath caught. For a moment, he didn't move or speak. "I tried to bury it," she said, tears mixing with a nervous smile. "I told myself it would ruin everything. But yesterday, when that beam fell and you pulled me out, I realized I was terrified not of dying, but of never telling you the truth." He took a slow step closer, eyes locked on hers. The air between them grew warm, electric. "You don't have to say anything else," he whispered. "But I want to," she said, her voice breaking. "Because if I don't, I'll regret it forever." For the first time in years, she saw something change in him. The calm mask he always wore began to fade. His eyes softened, full of emotion. "You think you're the only one who's been holding something back?" Her heart stopped. "Every time we work together, every time I look at you, I have to remind myself to stay in control," he continued. "You mean more to me than I can explain. But I never wanted to risk losing what we have." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something electric in the air. She smiled faintly through her tears. "Maybe we've both been protecting something that doesn't need protecting." He reached out slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed her cheek. "Maybe," he said softly, "we've been protecting the wrong thing." She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling his touch, her heart full but steady. When she opened them again, there was peace in her gaze. "Then promise me," she whispered, "that you won't run from this anymore." Before he could answer, the assistant director shouted from across the lot, calling them for reshoots. The moment shattered again, reality pulling them back. He smiled sadly, lowering his hand. "Looks like the universe still wants us to wait," but this time she didn't feel defeated. She looked at him and said softly, "Maybe not for long." As they walked back to set side by side, something had shifted between them. A quiet understanding, a silent vow. It wasn't over. It was just beginning to bloom in the spaces where words had failed. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid. Love, once hidden in whispers, had finally started to breathe. The world starts watching. The morning after the accident felt strangely calm, like the quiet after a storm that had changed everything without saying a word. Sandra woke before sunrise, her mind replaying every moment from yesterday. The rain, the crash, his arms around her, his trembling voice when he said she was more important. Those words hadn't left her since. They echoed in her chest with a kind of warmth that scared her. By the time she arrived on set, the world outside had already started whispering. Someone had filmed the aftermath of the accident, not the dangerous part, but the moment right after when Keanu was still holding her, rain pouring down, her hands gripping his coat. It wasn't supposed to be seen. It wasn't a scene. It was real, raw, human. And now it was everywhere. The tabloids called it the moment that proved everything. Headlines spread across screens. Keanu's heroic rescue, Sandra's emotional reaction, real chemistry, or more than that. Social media lit up. Fans posted clips slowed down to every glance, every breath. The world had finally seen what they had spent years hiding. When Sandra reached her trailer, her phone was already vibrating nonstop. Her publicist had left 12 messages. The studio wanted a statement, and her assistant looked panicked. "They're asking if it's true," her assistant said breathlessly. "If you and Keanu—" "It's not their business," Sandra said quietly, cutting her off. But deep down, her hands trembled. She knew this kind of story could spin out of control fast. Hollywood loved to build fantasies and destroy them just as quickly. Keanu arrived a little later, walking with that same unhurried calm. Yet she could tell from the set of his jaw that he'd seen the headlines too. When he reached her trailer, she was already waiting outside, arms folded, trying to stay composed. "I'm sorry," he said before she could speak. "I should have seen the cameras." She shook her head. "You saved me, Keanu. You don't have to apologize for that." He exhaled slowly. "The studio's worried. They think the story might overshadow the film. They're asking if we can both issue a statement saying it's just friendship." She went quiet. Her chest tightened. Those words, "just friendship," felt heavier now than ever. "Do you want to?" she asked finally. He looked down, thoughtful. "I don't want to lie. But I also don't want this to become some circus." The space between them filled with quiet understanding. For years they had guarded something fragile, something private. Now the world had forced it into the open. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's time to stop pretending for them too." He looked at her, eyes full of that same quiet tenderness that had drawn her in from the start. "You think we're ready for that?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm tired of hiding." They spent the rest of the day filming, trying to ignore the phones buzzing, the curious stares from crew members, the whispers that followed them everywhere. Yet in every scene, every shared glance, their emotions seemed sharper, truer. It was as if pretending no longer came naturally. By lunchtime, a journalist had somehow slipped past security and shouted a question across the lot. "Sandra, is it true you and Keanu are together?" The crew froze. Cameras turned. Sandra felt her heart race, but before she could answer, Keanu stepped forward, calm as ever. "We're here to make a film," he said simply, his tone kind but firm. "Everything else is noise." The journalist tried again, but the crew quickly escorted him out. Sandra looked at Keanu, both grateful and unsettled. She knew that behind his calm exterior was the same storm she felt. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she found him sitting alone near the old bench by the studio garden, the same place they'd sat on their first night of filming. The air smelled faintly of rain and jasmine. "You handled that well today?" she said quietly as she approached. He smiled faintly. "I've had practice avoiding things." She sat beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to avoid this anymore. Not with me." He turned to her slowly, eyes searching hers. "Do you know what happens if we stop hiding? If we let the world see what's really here? They'll talk," she said. "They'll guess. They'll twist it. And it'll change everything," he said softly. "The way they see us. The way they treat us. But it won't change what's real," she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "You've always been braver than me?" She shook her head. "No, I've just had more practice pretending I'm not scared." A light wind brushed through the garden. The sound of distant laughter floated from the crew tents. And then, as the quiet stretched between them, Sandra took a slow breath and said, "Keanu, if you're worried about what people will say, don't be. I've spent my whole life caring about the image. I think it's time I care about the truth instead." He didn't reply right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper worn at the edges. He hesitated, then handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I wrote years ago," he said softly, "after Speed. I never showed it to anyone." She unfolded the note carefully. It wasn't long, just a few lines written in his neat handwriting. Some connections never fade. They wait. They survive silence, distance, and time. And when the world quiets down, they remind you what home feels like. Her eyes filled with tears. "You wrote this about us?" He looked away, smiling shyly. "I guess I did." She folded the note back slowly, her heart pounding. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, she said, "Then maybe it's time the world knows too." He looked at her again, eyes warm, steady. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure." But before he could respond, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her agent. "Studio crisis meeting. Urgent. Both of you now." She exhaled slowly. "Here we go." They walked to the production office together. the night air cool against their skin. When they stepped inside, the room was tense. The director, producers, and PR team sat around a long table. Screens glowed with headlines. One of the producers spoke first. "We need to contain this. The press is running wild. If this turns into a scandal, it'll affect the film's release." "So you want us to lie?" Sandra asked calmly. "We want you to clarify," the PR manager corrected. "Say you're close friends, nothing more. Give it a week and it'll fade." Keanu stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sandra looked at him, waiting. After a long moment, he lifted his eyes. "What if we tell them the truth?" he said quietly. The room went dead silent. The producer frowned. "That's not wise. It complicates everything." But Sandra's voice followed softly, steady and clear. "So does pretending." No one spoke for a few seconds. Finally, the director sighed, rubbing his temples. "If you do this, you're changing the narrative. Forever." Keanu turned to Sandra, and for once there was no hesitation in his voice. "Then let's change it." The team argued, warned, debated, but their decision had already been made. That night, when the statement finally went out, it wasn't polished or dramatic. It was simple. We've shared years of friendship built on respect and kindness, and somewhere along the way, that friendship became something deeper. We're grateful for it, and we hope people will understand that what's real doesn't need to be hidden. Within minutes, the internet exploded again. But this time, it wasn't noise. It was warmth. Messages poured in, fans cheering, hearts melting, as the world read their truth. Sandra and Keanu sat side by side in quiet peace, watching the nightlights flicker across the city skyline. She leaned her head gently on his shoulder, whispering, "Feels strange, doesn't it? After all this time." He smiled softly. "Yeah, like breathing after holding your breath too long." For the first time in years, there were no cameras, no pretending, no whispers left unfinished. Just two souls who had finally stopped running from what they already knew. But neither of them realized, not yet, that the hardest part was still ahead. Because when the truth finally becomes public, love is no longer just between two hearts. It becomes a story the world believes it owns. When love meets the noise, the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Sandra woke up to flashing phone screens, endless notifications, and a world that suddenly had an opinion about her heart. Hollywood's most private pair finally admits the truth. The confession that broke the internet. Fans in tears as Keanu and Sandra reveal their hidden bond. At first, it seemed beautiful. Fans from all over the world posted old clips, interviews, and photos, moments where their eyes met, where smiles lingered too long. People celebrated their honesty. But fame, like fire, doesn't just warm. It burns. By the afternoon, the tone shifted. Tabloids began twisting the story. Talk shows questioned whether it was a publicity stunt. Anonymous sources appeared claiming drama on set. Even some producers hinted it could complicate future projects. The same truth that had freed them now started to close in. Sandra sat in her living room watching a news panel debate her personal life. Every sentence felt like an intrusion. She muted the television and stared at the silence, wondering how something so sincere could turn into noise so quickly. Her phone rang. It was Keanu. "You've seen it?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," she replied, her voice soft. "I didn't think it would blow up like this," he exhaled slowly. "They'll calm down soon." "They always do." "Maybe," she said, "but it feels like they're rewriting what we said." "Then we'll keep living the truth," he said gently. "They can't twist what's real." She smiled faintly at his calmness. That was always who he was, the quiet center in every storm. But she could hear something in his tone that wasn't there before. Exhaustion. Worry. Over the next few days, the chaos didn't fade. Paparazzi camped outside their homes. Journalists followed them from airports to cafes. Directors called, politely advising them to keep a lower profile. And slowly, distance began to creep in. They still texted every day, still met between shoots, but something unspoken had changed. The peace that had surrounded them was cracking under the weight of the world's attention. One evening, Sandra drove to his house without warning. She couldn't take the silence anymore. He opened the door before she even knocked, as if he'd been expecting her. "You look tired," he said softly. "So do you," she replied. They sat on the porch, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she turned to him. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly, his brow furrowed.
Regret what?
"Telling the truth." He shook his head immediately. "No, never. Then why does it feel like we're paying for it?" He looked out toward the dark skyline. "Because truth isn't free. It asks for everything." She let his words sink in. "I just didn't expect the world to feel so heavy." "They'll move on," he said softly. "They always do. Stories fade, but what's real stays." His calmness soothed her for a moment. But deep down, she could feel the pressure building, the calls from her agent, the interviews being canceled, the subtle looks from people who suddenly saw them differently. A week later, they were both called into a meeting with the studio executives. It wasn't about the film this time. It was about the headlines. The room was cold, corporate, and uncomfortable. "Look," the executive began, trying to sound diplomatic, "we respect you both. You're professionals. But this relationship is distracting from the project. The press coverage is overshadowing the work." Keanu's voice stayed calm. "So what are you suggesting?" "Just lay low for a while," the man said. "Separate interviews. Less public appearances. Give it space to cool down." Sandra clenched her jaw. "So we go back to pretending?" The executive hesitated. "Think of it as protecting the work." Keanu's eyes softened, but his tone carried quiet steel. "We've been protecting the work for years. Maybe it's time the work protects us." The room fell silent. No one argued after that. Outside the building, they stood together in the parking lot, the weight of the conversation pressing down like a shadow. "You shouldn't have to fight for this," she said. "Neither should you," he replied. They stared at each other, caught between defiance and fatigue. The world wanted distance, but their hearts wanted closeness. And then, as if the universe wanted to test them further, a flash went off nearby. A photographer had followed them. Within seconds, more appeared, shouting, snapping, asking questions. Keanu grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the car. "Let's go," he whispered. They drove away fast, hearts racing, the flashes still burning behind their eyes. When they finally stopped at a quiet overlook above the city, the silence hit them hard. Sandra looked out at the lights below, her voice trembling. "This isn't what I wanted. I just wanted the truth." He reached over, taking her hand gently. "You still have it." "We both do. But how long can we keep this up?" she whispered. "Every day feels like a war between what's real and what the world thinks it should be." He was quiet for a long time before he answered. "Then we stop fighting it. We live our truth quietly. Let them talk. Let them twist it. Eventually they'll get tired." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "And if they don't?" He smiled faintly, a mix of sadness and strength. "Then we'll just keep whispering until the noise fades." A tear slipped down her cheek, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from relief. The kind that comes when you realize love doesn't need an audience to survive. That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept peacefully. Not because the world had grown quiet, but because her heart finally had. But as peace returned, a new storm quietly gathered, one that would test not just their love, but their belief in what it meant to truly stand by each other when the lights went out. The whisper that finally mattered, days turned into weeks, and the world slowly began to move on. The headlines faded, the noise quieted, and for a brief moment it seemed like peace might return. But peace in Hollywood is fragile, and even silence carries its own kind of pressure. The film wrapped production under tight schedules, every scene carrying the weight of what had happened off-screen. The crew kept their distance, pretending nothing had changed, but everyone could feel it. The connection between Keanu and Sandra wasn't something that could be hidden anymore. It was written in their eyes, in every glance, every pause. When the final day of filming arrived, the air was heavy with endings. The last scene was simple, a quiet goodbye between their characters, filmed at sunrise on an empty street. No explosions, no drama, just stillness. It was supposed to be fiction, but everyone watching knew it was something more. As the sun broke through the fog, Sandra stood across from him, her heart aching with every unspoken word. The director whispered, "Action," and the world around them faded. "So, this is it," her character said softly, tears trembling in her voice. Keanu's voice was low, steady. "For now." She stepped closer, barely breathing. "You think we'll see each other again?" He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that says everything without a single word. "Some people never really leave," he said. The line wasn't in the script, but it fit perfectly. When the director called "cut," no one moved. Sandra felt her throat tighten. Her eyes glistened. She wanted to say something, but the words tangled in her chest. Keanu smiled gently, the kind of smile that could heal and break a heart at the same time. And then it was over. The set emptied. The crew hugged. The cameras shut down. She lingered behind, watching the sunlight hit the spot where he had just stood. Something inside her whispered that this moment couldn't end unfinished. Not again. That evening, there was a small wrap party. Laughter filled the air, glasses clinked, music played softly in the background. But Sandra wasn't really there. Her thoughts were miles away, at the quiet moments, the near confessions, the things left hanging between them. She looked around and saw Keanu standing outside by the balcony, alone, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. For a second, she just watched him, the calm presence that had grounded her for so many years. Then, without thinking, she walked over. He turned when he heard her footsteps, smiling softly. "Hey!" "Hey!" she replied, her voice trembling slightly. They stood there, side by side, overlooking the city. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of jasmine. It was quiet, just like every important moment they'd ever shared. "You know," he said finally, "I'm really proud of what we made." "Me too," she said, "but I'm even prouder of what we didn't hide." He looked at her, his eyes kind but uncertain. "Are you?" "Yeah," she said, "even if it cost us peace. At least it was real." He smiled faintly, looking down. "Real things are rare. That's why they're worth the noise," she whispered. For a while, they didn't speak. They just stood there, letting the quiet fill the space between them. Then she turned to him fully, her heart steady this time. "Keanu," she began, "there's something I never finished saying." He looked up slowly, the city's glow flickering in his eyes. "What's that?" She took a deep breath. "That night after the gala, when I almost told you how I felt, I stopped because I was scared. Scared of losing what we already had, scared of the world, scared of myself." Her voice trembled, but she kept going. "But every time I tried to move on, I couldn't. You've been there in every silence, every storm, every place I thought I could hide from my heart. You've been there, quietly, patiently, without asking for anything. And somewhere in all of that, I realized, I love you." Her words broke softly in the air, barely louder than a whisper. He didn't move at first, just looked at her, eyes wide with emotion. And then, slowly, his expression softened into something pure and unguarded. He stepped closer, his voice low. "You have no idea how long I've waited to hear that." Her breath caught. "You knew?" He smiled gently. "I felt it. Every time you looked away, every time you stayed a second too long, I felt it. But I wanted it to come from you." Her eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from relief, the kind that comes when truth finally finds its voice. "So," she whispered, smiling through it, "what now?" He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek. Now we stopped whispering. The city lights shimmered around them. The world below kept spinning, but up there, everything was still. They stood in that silence, two souls who had spent years circling each other, finally meeting in the middle. He leaned forward slightly, his forehead resting gently against hers. There was no need for grand gestures or promises. Love didn't need to shout. It just needed to be felt. For the first time, she wasn't acting, and he wasn't pretending to be calm. They were just themselves, quiet, imperfect, real. After a long moment, he whispered, "You changed my life, Sandra." "You saved mine," she replied softly. They stayed like that until the music faded and the world around them disappeared. The next morning, they left the city together before dawn. No reporters, no cameras, just a quiet car ride toward the hills. The sky was painted with soft gold light, and the air smelled like a beginning. She looked over at him, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression peaceful. "Where are we going?" he smiled. "Somewhere without scripts or headlines." She leaned her head against the window, watching the sun rise over the horizon. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Sometimes love doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it doesn't arrive with fireworks or applause. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, one that waits for years, patient and unwavering, until the moment both hearts are ready to listen. And in that quiet car, driving away from the noise, Sandra finally understood. The whisper she once feared to speak had always been the one thing strong enough to bring her peace.